Hello and welcome to SimCast, the higher education simulation podcast. My name's Tony Jeremy. I'm the academic lead for simulation-based education at UEA Norwich.
Hello everyone, my name's Lawrence Hill and I am the chair of the simulation group in the School of Health Sciences at UEA Norwich.
So Lawrence, what are we going to be talking about in today's episode?
Well, today in this episode, we're going to be talking about, we're going to be looking at simulation as a side hustle, finding time to do simulation as a busy academic or clinician.
If you enjoyed the episode, please give us a like. Equally so, if you didn't like the episode, give us a dislike, but let us know in the comments why, because we're always keen to improve. To keep up to date with all things sim, hit the subscribe button and don't forget to check that notification bell. And SimCast is now available on all popular streaming platforms, so just search for SimCast.
Nice, lovely. So let's face facts. Simulation is resource intensive, isn't it?
Very resource intensive.
Yeah, and really time intensive, whether that's planning it, writing it, facilitating it. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and can quite often feel like it's being kind of squeezed in amongst everything else.
Yeah, but on the flip side, we hear time and time again just how much our learners love simulation. They all, particularly with healthcare, they're hands-on practical learners. Mm-hmm. And what better way to learn than through something like clinical skills or simulation?
Yeah, there is too much simulation in this module. Said no student ever. Yeah, exactly. It's kind of credit to simulation's power as a pedagogical tool, and the feedback we often get is, "Oh, we need more sim." But actually, there are reasons why that can be quite difficult, which we'll talk about in this episode. But there's also that with every kind of increase in sort of simulation, it becomes less and less of a side hustle and more of a, actually, God, this is just what we do.
Yep. So we've got a group of learners who love using simulation as a way to learn. We've got a group of academics who are being pushed from pillar to post, and they are often spinning multiple plates.
Yeah.
So there's obviously a clash between the two. So I guess the episode today is about exploring that, the real world messiness, and the struggle that we often have as educators.
Yeah, talking of which, tell me a bit about what you do in addition to your simulation, to doing simulation. Okay. What do you do? What's in your portfolio as a busy higher education academic in operating department practice?
So I am I'm an associate professor in operating department practice. So that's my bread and butter course that I deliver. We have a 3-year BSc program, and I basically deliver half of the modules on it. So I've got 2 modules which I deliver in year 1 and 1 module that I deliver in year 3, which are year-long modules.
Right.
So my learners go into practice at certain points. So I get a little bit of, trough time where I can invest into things like simulation. But a lot of the time I'm doing a lot of teaching as well. Mm-hmm. As an academic, I'm also doing all of the assessment side of things. I'm an external examiner for another university. There are all sorts of different things that are competing with my time to do a simulation. As the simulation lead for the school, I have half of my time allocation for simulation, but I'm the only person in the school that has any time allocated officially towards simulation.
And we're talking about a school which has got thousands of learners.
Yes.
We're talking about I think one of the biggest, if not the biggest school at the University of East Anglia, several thousand. Yeah, like 3,000 learners, something like that total.
Added all of them up over the different 3-year programs that we do, we've got a lot of people who are coming through the school. And obviously simulation is one component of that, but pretty much all of our programs do some aspect of simulation in one form or another.
Sure. So it's a similar kind of picture for me in a way. I don't have any time allocated for simulation activity really other than teaching time, which, is a nominal amount of time in my working week.
Yeah.
I'm the course director for the paramedic degree program. I work 4 days a week for the University of East Anglia and a day a week for the College of Paramedics as their associate head of education. Just started, very excited by that.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Yeah. I'm really excited about that. But for 4 days a week, I'm a lecturer, an associate professor in paramedic science, and I'm a course director, and that takes up a chunk of time. I don't organise a module at the moment, but I have a professional lead role in that I line manage essentially a reasonably large team of 10, 11 staff members who are responsible for delivering a degree program. And in addition to that, I also am organising some new post-registration modules. And then, of course, we all have commitments to do with marking and moderation
and personal advisors. So we all have a load of students who we are their kind of go-to academic for advisees, and that I'm sure happens across different universities.
And just a huge amount of I always think of it, a huge amount of admin, but meetings, I think a lot of the time, email is like leadership described as disguised as admin. I feel like a lot of the time our roles include, giving examples and, finding solutions and that kind of stuff. So amongst all of that kind of...
We've got to jam simulation in somehow.
And it's really important because we know how important it is from a learner perspective, but also in terms of developing those competencies. Crucially, for delivering learning outcomes, simulation is absolutely core to healthcare education.
So another quick follow-up question, and I think it would be really useful to maybe ask our viewers also. But when you do simulation, typically, how long is that going to take out of your working day? If you do it like a simulation event, or there's a topic in your module or program which is sim based.
Yeah, it's almost without fail more than a whole normal working day.
Yeah,
because more often than not, we're going to want to arrive plenty of time before the students do to have a briefing and to discuss what's going to happen over the course of that day.
Yeah, you're always there early, aren't you?
Always.
On a sim day.
So, it's a day where I'll have to arrange childcare because I know that I'll be leaving the house before I can drop the kids at school. And then it's a whole day of teaching normally. And then normally during lunch, you're talking about how the
morning went,
how the morning's gone, and whether you need to make
afternoon.
any tweaks. And then generally afterwards, we're really lucky here at UEA in that we've got a fantastic team of simulation technicians who do a huge amount of the logistical, the clear up and the tear down kind of work.
Yeah.
But there's always things to discuss at the end.
Yeah. And have you at the end of a sim day gone to look at your emails and just thought, I'm exhausted.
Yeah. Really forget about simulation as a side hustle. It's like email as a side hustle.
What it is, isn't it? On a sim day, everything else kind of has to sit on the back burner.
Yeah.
So we have got this real challenge of juggling the two. And of course, we're talking about education. It's no different in clinical practice, is it? Because if anything, it's probably worse because the clinical need and requirement can't take second place to something like simulation. I know colleagues who try and run a simulation centre in a busy teaching hospital. There's maybe one or two of them for the whole hospital, and they're often in that position just because they're enthusiastic about simulation. Again, not recognising the time that's needed for it.
So actually, if you do have a time allocation for your simulation activity, whether you are a clinician or higher education or further education educator, we'd love to know about that. We'd love to know how much time you get, and then probably actually how much time you spend planning and delivering and writing sim.
So because simulation is resource intensive, I think it's safe to say you've got to be pretty organised for it to go well, or at least according to plan in the busy reality of the worlds that we work in. Yeah. So what can you do to be organised?
Well, I mean, we've talked, haven't we, on the podcast before and on our sim instructor course about planning simulation. So I think having a structure around having a structured way of approaching planning simulation will help, but it doesn't change the fact that there is a lot of planning to do. So organising it around, like a system like Site, where you think about, the surroundings, the information, the team and the equipment that you need, that's probably one step. But trying to stay ahead in your calendar, like you say, when you have those troughs, and that probably doesn't ever apply to our fellows in clinical practice. It's never a trough. It's winter pressures, January through December, isn't it? But trying to get ahead in some way, I think.
Okay, so we'll look at them a bit later in terms of like a strategy for survival, but something worth thinking about. Definitely being organised, just because the nature of simulation very resource intensive in terms of, like you say, the surroundings, the planning that needs to go behind it, the people that are involved, and obviously the equipment provision that you need as well.
But I think a major part of this is about communicating the importance and the value of simulation. And I think that's one way that we might be able to try and carve ourselves the time in order to do it. And
question, in healthcare education, I think most people have heard of simulation.
Yep, I reckon that's a fair assumption.
Do you think everyone understands what simulation is?
Definitely there is some variation in understanding about what it is. We were talking, weren't we, on the way back from the HPSN, the CAE conference just last before Christmas, and we were talking about the terminology that we use in simulation. I think even at that level, there is quite a wide variation in that's what people mean by simulation.
And that's simulation educationalists themselves,
exactly.
Isn't it? Let alone other people.
Yeah. So I think it's not surprising that there is some variation in terms of that. And so that makes communicating the value of simulation that bit more difficult. Because I think actually this issue of not understanding or not seeing a value in simulation occurs at different tiers.
Yeah.
I think it occurs at a kind of course tutor or educator tier. I think it occurs at a kind of sort of senior leadership tier within healthcare education organisations. I think it occurs at an institutional level, and I also would suggest that it occurs at a regulatory level as well.
So if we look at those levels, so at a course level, so you might have a module organizer responsible for a module. They want to put their own kind of slant on things and make it their own. If they don't see the value in simulation, it might mean that whole module doesn't get simulation in it.
Yeah. Or if they have a conception of simulation, which is that it's basically just doing some skills and then that's that, then that for me is part of the sort of the big picture of what simulation and skills practice-based learning looks like. But people might have different conceptions of what that is and the skills that are required in order to facilitate learning through simulation effectively. So it definitely occurs at that level. People who are saying they're doing simulation when actually they're probably doing some skills, or are doing kind of role play type exercises and calling it simulation, which might be a bit more complex, but they're not using a kind of formal kind of briefing and debriefing model.
Yeah, and we've come across this before, haven't we? We've spoken to colleagues who said they don't really understand sim, and actually when you unpack some of what they're doing, you're like, that's pretty much simulation. You're just repackaging, you're calling it something different. You might be like a problem-based learning or something like that, but actually you're blurring the lines between what you think you're doing and actually what simulation is. Yeah. What about at a senior management level then?
Well, I mean, like, I think the first thing to say is that clearly the School of Health Sciences at UEA can see the value in simulation.
Yeah, of course.
And there's been great investment from the government essentially to help build this centre, and a recognition that simulation is important. But I think the fact that you are the only person within the school with a dedicated time allocation is kind of, that's kind of emblematic, really. I think clearly it's for a leadership function, and people might argue that simulation kind of falls into teaching, which it probably does.
Yeah, I think it comes down to money as well, doesn't it? Budget and finances, because, in an ideal situation, we would have someone non-academic who is a manager of the simulation centre. I think that would be important. But then finding the finances for that to happen, having a post-release for that when we need more nursing lecturers, when we need more technical staff, when we need X, Y, and Z is challenging. And again, it often, the manager is getting pressures from the person above them and then the person above them as well, and wanting to see tangible results. And sometimes that doesn't always happen, does it, with simulation?
No, that's right. So yeah, absolutely, it doesn't always, because actually most of those tangible results are individualized in the heads of the learners.
Yeah.
And so it's harder to demonstrate that value at a kind of senior leadership kind of level sometimes, because it's not seen.
And when that's captured in things like the National Student Survey, but those questions are predetermined at a national level, and they don't look at the specifics in terms of things like simulation. No. So then the onus is on the learner to be creative enough to mention how their learning experience was made better by something like simulation. And of course, that's
if they happen to think about it when they're writing out the survey.
Exactly.
So I mean, just by way of example, so I have no formal time allocation for simulation, although I am clearly, I'm passionate about simulation. I love sim, all things sim. But is this a good use of my time? And if I was line managing me, I might ask the same question. Is simulation a good use of my time? Is producing this podcast, is this academic leadership? Is this important, or is it actually not so important in the sort of strategic objectives of delivery of a School of Health Sciences? It doesn't generate revenue. It's generated a small amount of scholarship, but not a loads. And I think that's not really an issue at a school level. It's perhaps more of, that there needs to be some recognition of the scholarly and pedagogical value of simulation at the level of institution. Yeah. And I think that's what it is.
Again, with us being advanced beginners in simulation rather than world leading.
Well, quite, yeah. So I think it's, what does it say about simulation more widely as a kind of as a scholarly pursuit, as a pedagogical tool?
Yeah,
and I think it's there when you realise you're actually we're still in quite a nascent, emerging area of healthcare education.
That segues quite nicely on, because I think whilst healthcare simulation has been around for a couple of decades now, at least, it's still really in its infancy and still developing.
Yeah.
And so institutionally understanding that is the next challenge.
Yeah. And that is a really good point, because institutions, for example, the University of East Anglia has a staff-student ratio for programs of education, and there's no distinction between, for example, a history of art program or English or any of the humanities and healthcare education programs, which, as we were saying, are just so much more intensive. When it takes you a team of 6 people to deliver a day's teaching for 45 learners, whereas that might take effectively 1 tutor's time to deliver 2 couple-of-hour lectures over the course of a day. Actually, what simulation costs healthcare educators in terms of time, in terms of departments, is so much greater. And that's not, there's no differentiation, I don't think, that I'm aware of at an institution level that recognises the resource intensivity of sim.
Yeah. Big challenge.
Yeah.
Big challenge when you try and centralise everything.
Yeah.
And regulate it that way.
And, I wonder whether anyone listening in or watching has had similar experiences that, have you had to try and justify the increasing staff load that you need to deliver simulation in the context of an organisation which says, but a lecture is delivered by one person and teaches 200 people?
Yeah.
So, yeah. And then above that,
Talking of regulation. Regulatory bodies.
Yeah.
Well, I think we need to just perhaps tread on this a little bit cautiously. Just you and I discussing. But I think it's a nice opportunity perhaps maybe to get someone on the podcast in the future. But simulation and its definition and understanding by regulatory bodies differs.
Yeah.
I think. The NMC, the GMC, the HCPC all look at simulation slightly differently, whether it is educational, whether it can be aligned to practice hours.
Yeah.
And again, it tends to muddy the waters a little bit in terms of people understanding what simulation is and its application.
Yeah, where does simulation sit within the context of practice-based learning? Is that there is a different perception of that across the varying regulators?
There's a big desire at the moment to use simulation to, for want of a better phrase, plug the gaps in practice shortfalls in lots of areas.
And actually, that's not just a UK phenomenon. That is an international phenomenon, which is occurring in the States. It's occurring in Australia. Australian paramedics do a huge amount of simulation before they go out into ambulance practice. But this is a super juicy topic, and we're not going to do it justice here. So if you would like to come on the podcast, and I really hope you do, if you'd like to come on and, for want of a better word, defend simulation as a tool for practice-based learning, as a replacement for practice learning for placement, we'd love to hear from you.
And equally so, if you want to give the counter argument, then you're more than welcome to come on and voice that point of view as well.
And we will play devil's advocates.
We will indeed.
That will be a juicy discussion. I really think it's one that we need to have, though. I think it'd be an important conversation in the context of healthcare education.
I think what we can say from that, though, is there are so many potential misunderstandings with what simulation is, how it can be useful, and then understanding the nuances at it. Because, again, it's it feels like it's a buzzword at the minute. It
Yep.
feels like you can just chuck simulation at a problem and it
Yep.
fixes it. And of course, it's not a panacea,
Mm-mm.
and it's very, very complicated. And actually, when you get down to the nuts and bolts of it on the shop floor, it means actually delivering sim can be really, really challenging.
Yeah.
Particularly when you're strapped for resources and you're a busy academic or a busy clinician, where simulation isn't the be all and end all.
Yeah, indeed. Okay. So you're a busy academic, right? If you're pushed for time, which is like probably most of the time,
Yep.
and you're planning or you're thinking about running simulation, what is it that suffers? Where are the pinch points?
Okay, so for me, I might just be inclined to roll something out again, what I've delivered last year without reviewing it. So that process of review, the process of if I've got something new, maybe testing, because you need time to do that.
Simulating your simulation.
Simulating your simulations, which is, advocated, but not always possible.
Yeah.
You're probably going to need some faculty to do that as well. So getting all those people together to run through the sim for the first time, to test it, to tease out any problems, to go, actually we need this bit of kit and equipment as well with it, or we hadn't considered X, Y, and Z. That's useful, but it often doesn't happen. A period of review, particularly peer review. So sending scenarios out to maybe a subject expert to have a look at, go through with a fine-tooth comb and make comments.
Presumably also the peer review of your simulation facilitation as well.
Yeah.
How often do you contact someone in advance and say, I'm running some simulation. We've got extra pairs of hands. Would you be happy to come and peer review my debrief?
It's often opportunistic, isn't it? It's often actually someone who you've just got to help you with facilitation will go, I can do a peer review for you.
Yeah.
Not someone specifically who's removed from that. And actually that's probably a much better environment for them to do that review. So so a lot of the kind of the quality assurance, I guess, around delivering good quality simulation could potentially suffer if you're either not organised or you just don't have the time to do it.
I think one of the things for me that gets relegated is the opportunity for formal evaluation and scholarly output. I think it's busy enough when you're organising a sim and you're flat out just trying to get it organised, get your team there, and make sure you've got the equipment and make sure you've got the rooms ready. And
you're not thinking about I need to get this through ethics approval, so actually I can write this up
until after the fact, and then it's probably a bit too late. So I think that's one of the things, and the irony there is that it's exactly that
which is needed to help explain the usefulness of simulation.
So that I think is for me one of the things that and some people do it. Some people do manage to do it because there is some brilliant stuff that you see, some brilliant simulation evaluations in the literature.
I guess it needs good planning. It needs frameworks that people can, when they don't have enough time, they can just still grab it and do it. And it's certainly something that we're looking at within our organisation, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, then. So that's the things that get relegated a little bit sometimes. What about the things that you think have to stay regardless? What are sacrosanct into the simulation?
Great question. So for me, it's all the areas where it provides high quality learning for the learners. So for me, you can't sacrifice the importance of psychological safety, taking the time out to work with your learners to ensure that they know it's an environment for learning rather than an environment where they're just going to be evaluated and made to feel ridiculous if something goes wrong. Equally so, the debrief.
Yeah.
And it's ironically, is often an area when you're pushed for time, they get scrimped and saved because we need to get through that other scenario. And I've said this before, I'd much rather cull the scenario, just concentrate on the quality of the debrief instead.
Yeah, that is a cardinal sin, isn't it, of simulation, curtailing the debrief to squeeze the simulation into the day. That's just given me an idea for another episode. We did that thought, and we'll have a chat about that afterwards. We did the 4 horsemen of the debrief apocalypse, but it'd be amazing to hear from anyone what you think are the cardinal sins of simulation. What is it that you see happen, or that you've done yourself, or that you would just deplore when you see other people do it? We won't get into that now because we'll get hopelessly off track.
And debrief, not feedback.
Oh yes, okay, fine. Yeah, that's good. So we started on that episode already, but I concur. The importance of the briefing to establish psychological safety, the articulation of the intended learning outcomes, and the opportunity for adequate debrief
and reflective conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
So basically, the quality, that means that you have a good learning experience for your learners. I think you can't scrimp and save on that.
Yeah, it's the kind of patient-centered bit, isn't it? Like it's the, if you're a clinician, it's the bit actually, you know, that the admin can wait. What matters is the patient care, it's the student care.
We're going to do another episode on what you can scrimp and save on. Yeah. Both in terms of practical and again, educational theory for simulation. Because again, the real world messiness means that sometimes, you know, you are in a less than perfect situation.
Okay, so I think it's probably fair. We should probably try and summarize these into kind of strategies for surviving simulation as a side hustle.
Yeah.
So we've organized these around the site model, which we talked about at the HPSN conference back in December. But talk to us, Tony. What are the strategies for survival, do you think?
Okay, so if we look at the site model, so looking at the surroundings first, making sure you got your rooms booked for your simulation event, that obviously goes without saying. The sooner you can get that booked, the better. If you start leaving it to the last minute, you run the risk of not having anything to do or having a room which is not fit for purpose, both in terms of physical layout and maybe the technology that you need to make your simulation work if you're doing, you know, an audio visual stream to another room.
It's like probably the hardest bit to make do, isn't it? You haven't got a space, you're not running sim. Yeah.
So again, depending on your institution, there'll be different ways which you do that. We do our simulation timetabling almost a year in advance. You have to get that stuff in, otherwise you don't have the facilities to do it. So your hand is almost forced in a way, which is good, but it's a big project. If you are working in let's say a different environment, or you are an educator which is doing more ad hoc sim, you have to appreciate that is going to take time. So you still have, I'd say a couple of months, you probably have to plan that in advance, probably in most places, because you're going to be competing for that space with other interested parties.
Of course.
If we look at information.
The information phase, the sort of the bits that inform what you're going to be doing in the simulation. And I'd say for me, it's about having a strategy for survival is having an absolutely kind of razor sharp focus on the intended learning outcomes.
Yeah.
You know, and probably being flexible about how they can be achieved. Because if you're
well, they'll dictate what you need to do, won't they?
Yeah. They will dictate what you need to do. And actually, so like you said, under information, if you have a kind of a bank of simulation that you've built up over time of kind of standardized patient scenarios, then recycling those is probably a good strategy for managing that pressure.
If you can't, then there are workarounds, should we call it?
Definitely. There are digital assistants.
We've used AI to help us write simulation scenarios. So there'll be a link to the episode up there for the episode on AI. Just tread with caution, because I have done it myself where I've used AI to generate simulations. It whilst you might think it's time saving, I think the conscientious educationalist would double check and triple check what has been done, created by the AI, to make sure it's correct. So just be mindful of that. But certainly if you're got that writer's block, it can be really, really helpful to write simulations.
Definitely. I think with writing your own simulation from scratch, the writing phase and thinking phase is long and the kind of editing phase is short. With using AI, the writing phase is like 5 seconds, and then the editing phase has to be longer. So
the review phase. What that does is it forces your hand into making sure that you're reviewing it, perhaps not a peer review, but you're certainly reviewing those simulations, which is one of the issues we talked about earlier.
What about team then? So team, you know, the people that you're working with, what strategies could we have under team to help survive?
When I'm planning and organising sim, I always have that in the back of my mind. I've got X, Y, these people I know I can depend on when it comes to simulation. You ping out that email to the whole school, you can guarantee these 2, 3, 4 people are going to reply straight away.
Consistently good and responsive people who will help out. And having a kind of go-to team, for want of a better word, of competent capable educators who you can basically chuck them a scenario and go, I appreciate you're not expert in this, Tony, but can you run this ALS or can you run this scenario?
Yeah, with a group of learners perhaps you haven't been working before. And actually they often say that was really nice to work with a different group of people. And of course what we're trying to do is expand that further by making sure that we've got good quality educational provision for people delivering simulations.
Yes.
So making sure that they've got, they're trained to a basic threshold standard, whether that's an in-house course or something like the Resource Council's GIC training, the General Instructors course is a great one to do as well. Yeah,
indeed. And I think under team as well, having a good working relationship with the simulation technicians or the technical side or the technical team is really important, because more often than not, they'll know, what is the right kit to be using or what kit's available as well. And
often save your bacon on the day if needed to as well.
Yeah, so it's well worth. So that I think is probably under team. Those are those ones. What about equipment then? What about survival strategies for equipment?
Having the minimal viable kit, I think, and equipment to make your simulation in some way believable. Again, looking at things like that psychological safety, getting buy-in, developing a fiction contract. You do need a minimum standard. Again, we'll come back to this when we do our scrimping and saving episode. So again, that needs planning, particularly if it's consumables, which need to be ordered in. All of these things need to be taken into consideration. And again, working with your technical team, they'll give you a much better understanding of those kind of lead-in times.
Yeah, for sure.
And when you don't have it, maybe being creative with some of your resources as well.
Yeah, being able to be a bit flexible and to be like, hey, and being transparent as well with the learners as well. I think, hey guys, we haven't got everything we needed today. But this is what we're going to work with, because we're going to focus on these learning outcomes, because actually assert basic assumption, we know you want to do well, and this is what we've got.
It might mean you have to change your learning. I've been in a situation before when we haven't had enough sterile gowns to do scrubbing with the number of students. So we've had to repackage them. And of course, part of that process is putting them on in a certain way that you can don your gown using aseptic technique. And that meant that we had to adjust those learning outcomes because they weren't able to achieve that. Right. So it just depends, doesn't it? But, cancelling the whole event when you have a potential workaround seems a little bit dramatic.
Yeah, agreed. Okay. So we've discussed various aspects today of simulation as a side hustle. And I think it's probably fair to conclude that it's messy, the reality of being a simulation educator, when you're fitting it in with loads of other stuff, whether that's clinical or other academic responsibilities. And often it means that we're stretched and we're juggling and we have to find workarounds.
Yeah. Nice way to sum things up.
Well, thank you. And we hope you enjoyed listening and watching this episode, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.